תודה רבה. תודה רבה. אני מתכבד להזמין את פרופסור לורי בלנק, שהיא כבר חלק מהמכון, כמו שציין ראש המכון עמוס. בבקשה, לורי.
תודה רבה. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm very happy to be back at the Institute. What I want to talk about today is to follow on some of what Laurent was talking about. Over the last 10, 12 years, there's been a lot of discussion in the United States, here, around the world, both in the policy and academic communities, about the challenges of fighting against an enemy who purposely hides among innocents. And this has focused mostly on identifying the people. Who can we identify as the enemy from the soldier's perspective? Who can I shoot? And then, you know, if you capture someone, how do you treat them? It's very focused on the person aspect. But there's obviously a whole other aspect to warfare, and that's the objects that you can target. We heard a little bit just now about the definition of military objective and the need to be discriminating in identifying what sort of targets you can go after. And I want to build on that from a couple of different perspectives. First, I want to look at some of the challenges of actually identifying what are objects, not people, but buildings and other things that can be targeted in the course of a conflict with a non-state group in these types of densely populated areas. And then I want to look at some of the challenges posed by the conduct of these groups and how the law could do a better job of dealing with them, or how the international community could use the law better in dealing with these challenges. So we start with the principle of distinction, which is one of the most fundamental principles of the law governing armed conflicts, and that says that you must distinguish between military and civilian in your targeting, and distinguish between military objectives and civilian objects. The next piece of that, with regard to objects, is that there's a prohibition on attacking civilian objects. Obviously, in order to carry out that prohibition, you have to be able to figure out which ones are civilian and which ones are military. We all here have read the news. I don't need to tell you about how buildings are being used, you know, hospitals or mosques or churches and other buildings, schools are being used for military purposes, but nobody puts a sign up on it and says, hi, I'm using this for a military purpose now, so now you know what I'm doing. Obviously, the idea is to obfuscate and to make it difficult to figure out what's going on. And then, of course, the fact that all these objects are in close proximity to the civilian population only adds to the complication. I want to step back from the legal doctrine and look at the military doctrine here, at the idea of targeting and what is the purpose of targeting objects. And that helps then look at the legal perspective and how we understand the law. So in the U.S., targeting is generally defined as, and elsewhere obviously, but I'm just reading to you from the U.S. definition, targeting is the process of applying combat power to achieve desired objectives within the overall operational plan by destroying, disabling, degrading, or harassing enemy capabilities. So there's a lot going on there. Obviously, you have to be able to identify what your objective is in going after a particular target, and we can keep in mind that there's more than just destroying things. You may want to simply make it impossible for the enemy to use something. You may want to minimize their ability to use it, neutralize it. You may want to keep them from accessing their stores of supplies. So simply by harassing fire near an area, they can't get to their supply, and that obviously affects their ability to fight. So we think about lots of reasons why you might choose to target a particular object as a background to looking at the definition of military objective and how it applies in these kinds of conflicts. So we already heard from Laurent. We look at two components of the definition of a military object. A military objective is something that makes an effective contribution to military action because of its nature, location, use, or purpose, and that its total or partial destruction, capture, or neutralization offers a definite military advantage. Again, not a vague, illusory advantage, but something concrete and direct. The last piece of that is if you're not sure, if there's doubt, something has to be presumed to be a civilian object. I want to give a couple examples from other conflicts, not those taking place that are going on in this area of the world, but some other conflicts to try to look at how things have been reported in the news and how we can think about the types of objects that state forces are targeting in the course of conflicts with non-state actors. These are just pulled out of the news. Just to give an example, the description is sometimes very vague and sometimes very clear, and that, of course, is one of the interesting features as we look at this. So, for example, Turkey, in its efforts to combat the PKK, things that they have targeted have included very obviously military things like anti-aircraft defenses, then things described much more vaguely as rebel positions or facilities harboring the PKK, which if you look later in that same news story was also described as villages. So it's interesting to sort of see how things are presented. In Mali, the most recent situation, we see that the French are targeting Islamic targets. I don't know exactly what that means. I'm not questioning what things are being targeted, but there's no way to know from the description what is an Islamic target. I assume it's not a mosque, obviously, but it's interesting. In Sri Lanka, where there was a 20-plus year conflict and the LTTE held a lot of territory in the north of the country, some examples have been a terrorist stronghold, a rebel-held town. The LTTE had a naval base. If you look at these, the naval base, pretty obvious, but what does a terrorist stronghold mean? I don't know. We need to be more specific in terms of actually fleshing out the legal definition based on these sorts of descriptions. So to just briefly look at some of these components of the definition, nature is going to be any object directly used by the armed forces. It's something that's inherently military. Can easily list those: weapons, equipment, staff headquarters, fortifications, depots, all different kinds of things like that, communication centers. Other examples that have been listed, including a rather lengthy list by the ICRC 60 years ago now, 70 years ago, I don't know, 1956 maybe, includes things like broadcast facilities, which can be used for communications purposes, industries for the manufacture of armaments and other supplies of a military nature and essential to the conduct of war, such as, you know, the engineering factories or chemical factories, the war ministries, obviously. So one question that comes up from this, specific to the types of conflicts that we're talking about at this conference here with non-state groups in densely populated areas, is what does this idea of a military nature mean when you're talking about a group that is not a state? It doesn't necessarily have a governing apparatus. And one of the big questions that comes up here that is, I think, regularly debated and doesn't necessarily have a very clear answer is, how do you assess the relationship between the armed entity of this non-state group and other parts of it? How do you figure out which components of this non-state group are actually the military components, the armed force components, and which have more of a political or a social service component or others? And this is a very difficult question because obviously it's partly going to depend on your perspective. It's very easy to consider that everything to do with the opposing force is the enemy. But I think that may be a bit broad, and it's challenging to assume that everything connected with them is automatically a military target. Another piece here is the whole notion of legitimacy concerns in terms of the civilians that are going to be affected by this. So if we think about targeting infrastructure that would certainly enable the other side to fight better, could be transportation, it could be communications networks. And here we get into issues of cyber weapons and cyber activities and cyber operations as you think about communication networks and all kinds of capabilities like that. What are the consequences in terms of the civilian, not just the actual damage to the civilian population, but to the way the civilian population is going to view your actions, the actions of the other side? It's very important to consider legitimacy. We talk about hearts and minds, especially when you're talking about fighting against a group that's located in another state. And now you have concerns as well operationally about the impact on the civilians in that state who are not involved in this not necessarily involved at all in the fighting, not necessarily remotely supportive of this other group. They just happen to live in the same place where the group has decided to launch its operations. There's a lot of legitimacy considerations there as well. I want to switch now to the question of how can the law do a better job in terms of enforcing the obligation to protect civilians in the course of armed conflict with regard to these questions about the types of objects that are used in military operations, in conflicts in densely populated areas. We read a lot in the news. We see in the scenario today, there's a lot of questions about the use of civilian objects, civilian buildings, civilian structures for military purposes. So this is the opposite side of the question of what objects are inherently military in terms of understanding the definition of military objective. Another component of the definition of military objective is something that's being used or its purpose is for military purposes. So, for example, the enemy forces occupy a school and use that as their headquarters. Well, a school is inherently civilian. Once it's being used by the other side, it's being used to launch attacks, it's being used as their headquarters, it becomes military and you can target it. So what happens in terms of the other side's responsibility there? This comes out most obviously when we think of objects that are specifically protected. Cultural property, religious property, hospitals. It's a violation of international law to use protected objects for military purposes. It happens all the time. We see it happen all the time. And yet there is not yet sufficient condemnation of this practice. Perhaps one reason is that there are so many other violations of the law, so many atrocities going on in conflicts around the world that seem significantly more grave. And indeed they are. When we look at what happened, in the Congo, where you might have, 10,000 rapes in a day, or you think of atrocities in Darfur, or what's happening right next door in Syria, perhaps the use of a hospital as your headquarters, that seems much less important as something to condemn. However, the failure to condemn it creates a situation in which that type of activity goes on. And when it goes on, what does it do? It endangers the civilian population. It's very obvious, obviously, in the case of a hospital, there are patients in there. There are wounded fighters from both sides who are in there, who are deserving of the protection of the law. All of those people are in danger. But it doesn't just have to be a hospital or a mosque. Pick any type of civilian object, a residential building, a school, it could be a nursing home. It doesn't matter. When those objects are used by the one side for military purposes, the entire civilian population is in much greater danger because it's much harder to distinguish, to carry out that fundamental obligation that's at the heart of the law's focus on protecting people during the course of armed conflict. And yet, we don't see this being condemned sufficiently. And I would argue that the failure to condemn this actually facilitates that behavior. It incentivizes those who are doing this to continue to do so. And why does it do this? Well, in two different ways in particular. One is at the tactical level. Why would a group use a civilian object? Well, they want to put the other side in the position of having to make a very difficult choice. One is to choose not to attack a target. So they have to refrain from attacking a target that's posing a threat, that has a military purpose, so they can't necessarily fulfill their mission as well. On the other hand, the flip side of that choice is not a good one either, which is to put civilians in great danger, maybe kill a great number of civilians. So they're left with, in essence, this very difficult choice. And that's the immediate tactical effect of using buildings for military purposes when they shouldn't be so used. There's a broader strategic effect here, which we see happening over and over in recent years, which is this: the use of buildings is actually designed to cause a great deal of civilian casualties. Then those civilian casualties are used to first accuse the other side of war crimes, and by doing so to diminish support for their war effort. So take the example of the United States and Afghanistan. Earlier on, there were high numbers sometimes, not necessarily very high, but maybe higher than certainly U.S. forces wanted. There would be civilian casualties from airstrikes on legitimate targets, but there were civilians present. It's hard to know. That was used to argue that the U.S. was committing war crimes in Afghanistan, to try to diminish domestic American support for the war effort. That makes it then harder in terms of maintaining the political will to carry out the conflict. And also, certainly here in Israel, you see that in terms of questions of international legitimacy. This is a challenge that you face day in and day out with these conflicts. This ultimately is another way that non-state groups, terrorist groups, militants are manipulating civilians for their own military purposes. It's a broader strategic purpose, but it has just as much of an effect. It causes just as much civilian damage. Now, there is a principle of international law, or provision of international law, that prohibits locating military objectives in densely populated areas, using civilians to protect military objectives as human shields. It's a principle of customary international law. Laurent referred to it as well. And yet it rarely gets mentioned in cases, in international reports, in commissions of inquiry. And I think this failure to condemn has a great effect not only on enabling this practice to continue, making it successful, which is a huge problem not only from the operational perspective of the forces who are fighting against, whether they be state forces or you could have two non-state groups fighting against each other, certainly. It's not just a state problem. But it certainly has an effect on the law itself. So if you can speak from the perspective of the development of international law and its ability to continue doing its job, we, sort of the royal we, need to make sure that all aspects of the law are being enforced as effectively as possible, even if they seem to be less dramatic and less attention-grabbing than, the genocide in whether it's in Darfur or Rwanda. Those are the big attention-grabbing atrocities, issues that we see. But the smaller things have just as much of a consequence in terms of both the operational and the human consequences of war. Thank you.